Hi, welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. In this episode, we'll be celebrating another African legend, William Edward Bogart Du Bois, more popularly known as W E B DUBOIS, and yes, Du Bois, not Dubois. I'm being faithful to the way he pronounced his name. W E B Du Bois was a sociologist, historian, and great thinker and activist. His works focused on African American communities, Africa, and the African diaspora. His thoughts and activism helped to shape Black political culture in the United States as one of the most active founders of the NAACP and internationally through the Pan-African movement. W E B Du Bois was born on the 23rd of February, 1868. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he also spent his early years. A consummate scholar from childhood, W E B Du Bois graduated as the valedictorian from his high school in 1884. He was supported by his community to study for his Bachelor of Arts at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. While studying at Fisk, he taught in African American schools during the summer holidays. After receiving his first degree from Fisk, he was accepted to study at Harvard, but he first had to study for another bachelor's degree because almighty Harvard did not recognize his degree from Fisk, which was a Black university. He proved the quality of the education which he got from Fisk by graduating cum laude from Harvard within 2 years. He then proceeded to continue studying history and economics at the University of Berlin in Germany. He got a Master of Arts from Harvard in 1891, and in 1895 he became the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. One of the earliest researches which he carried out on a Black community in Philadelphia between 1896 and 1897 was groundbreaking because it allowed him to provide empirical evidence to debunk the negative views held about Black people. He also used his research to prove that the problems of the Black community was due to segregation, and he highlighted the importance of democratic equality. Unlike most of his contemporaries who were advocating at the time, Du Bois believed that Black people in the US should embrace their African heritage while participating as equal citizens within the larger society. Dr. Du Bois was an integral player in the founding of the NAACP as well as the Pan-African movement. He was the one who articulated the call by the Pan-African movement for the recognition of first the sovereignty of the few independent Black countries like Haiti, Liberia, Abyssinia, Ethiopia in 1900. He also challenged views held by scholars in elite schools like Columbia University, which blamed Black people for the failure of Reconstruction. I will return to the bogus studies by Columbia University later. But first, let me quickly talk about Reconstruction. because it was a significant interlude in African American history. Reconstruction was the brief period between 1865 and 1877, during which black people in America enjoyed self-determination. This was after the Civil War, when the northern parts of the US, which won the war, tried to make good the promise which had been made during the war to lure black people into joining them in the fight against the South, which was the stronghold of slavery. Now, the North had promised that if they won, slaves would be given their freedom. So, to honor this promise, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which declared civil and political rights for African Americans across the South. These amendments gave African Americans their freedom, and they were guaranteed the same rights as any other American citizens. In addition, black men were given the right to vote, just like their white contemporaries, because at the time, the vote was generally denied women. As a result of these amendments, about 700 African Americans were actually elected to hold various public offices. 7 of them even emerged as senators, and 14 others won seats to the House of Reps. This was, of course, met by stiff opposition from the South. The South was still smarting from losing the war, but to now expect them to allow their former slaves enjoy all these rights? All over the South, hell broke loose. The South went into action to enact their own laws, which they called the Black Codes. They are better known to us as Jim Crow laws. Now, these laws limited the legal rights of black people to only things like the right to marry and own some property. And although the Black Codes allowed African Americans to sue in court, it was illegal for them to serve on juries or testify against white people or even serve in state militias. The Black Code also stipulated that black sharecroppers and tenant farmers had to sign annual labor contracts with their white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested and hired out for work, whether or not they wanted to. Another significant thing to note is that this was the time when the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was born to terrorize African Americans in the South, especially the community leaders. Also, after the war, a progressive movement by some members of the US Congress tried to provide land to former slaves, but the move was thwarted, and so it was unsuccessful. As a result, former slaves were not compensated for their enslavement. This made some black people in a few places in the South decide to seize land from their former owners. But the federal troops that were situated in the South at the time, rather than support the black people to hold on to the land that they seized, they actually helped restore the land to the white landowners. And so by 1871, even though the Congress passed legislation that was supposed to curb the KKK, the federal government's military presence was totally withdrawn from various southern states. And by 1877, the last of the federal troops in the South were finally withdrawn. Without the troops to enforce the laws that allowed the amendments that allowed black people to live freely, Reconstruction collapsed, and all across the South, lynching, disenfranchisement, and segregationist laws were passed and enforced to return former slaves to servitude. Imagine having enjoyed freedom for a few years and then suddenly being forced back into slavery. So black Americans in the South had to wait till 1962 with the effort of the civil rights movement before the Jim Crow laws were finally outlawed. Of course, black people were blamed for the failure of Reconstruction. As I said earlier, a group of scholars from Columbia University had actually conducted a sham research which concluded that the reason why Reconstruction failed was because black people were lazy and incompetent. This again demonstrates one of the ways in which academic institutions colluded with oppressive regimes in order to continue the exploitation of black people. It is not too different from what is going on now in academic circles. Dr. Du Bois first challenged this research by academics from Columbia University in a paper in which he pointed to the role of the federal government in sabotaging the efforts of the Southern black leaders as the major reason for the failure of Reconstruction. He also listed some of the significant achievements of black people during Reconstruction. He insisted that as brief as the period of Reconstruction was, black people succeeded in establishing free schools and putting some social welfare systems in place. He later went